Professor Chaffetz. Talk about the significance of this vote and how it took place, the American Studies Association vote.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for having me on. Well, the vote came about because the Activism Caucus of the American Studies Association brought forward a resolution based on the Asian American Studies resolution that supported the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And that resolution then went to the National Council, well, went to the Executive Committee, who passed it on to the National Council, which voted unanimously to support it just recently, I think December 4th. And from there, it went to the vote of the entire membership, who, as you pointed out, for those who came out to vote, supported it, I believe, 66% in favor. So that's the origin. It answers a call, and this is important, from the Palestinian academic and cultural boycott of Israel, which was announced in 2004, and which asked people around the world, organizations around the world, to support this boycott. And that was a call from Palestinian civil society. You can go to their, certainly the website of the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, and there are over 171 organizations, unions of farmers, unions of workers, professional organizations that support that boycott. So it was in response to a specific call.
And what does the boycott mean?
Well, the boycott means, first of all, I wouldn't downplay symbolism and visibility. The Palestinian cause, particularly in the United States, where it does not get a fair representation in the press, needs visibility. But it also can have practical effects down the road. Certainly boycotts during the civil rights movement here in the United States and boycotts in South Africa had those effects by putting precise material pressure on institutions who were supporting various oppressive regimes.
And Carrie Nelson, could I ask you to respond? Why is it that you were opposed to an academic boycott, and this academic boycott in particular?
Sure. Well, the AAUP has, for many years, opposed all academic boycotts, basically because we believe that what's most desirable is to keep free exchange amongst academics worldwide and to do everything possible to facilitate all kinds of intellectual and cultural exchanges between academics. And we're well aware that saying that you can simply boycott a university and not have an impact on its faculty members is really a false kind of reasoning. If Ben Gurion University funds the travel of 6 of its members to come to the American Studies Association meeting and pays their registration fees directly, that presumably is unacceptable because it's a relationship between the ASA and an Israeli university. So it simply is false to suggest that interchanges between American and Israeli faculty members won't be compromised by this, should it really take any effect. But I think more deeply, the AAUP has never opposed economic boycotts. And I personally am very interested, have for many years supported an economic boycott of West Bank industries. I think Israel needs to get out of the West Bank. And I'm interested in targeted economic pressure to encourage, if not Bibi's government, at least some future Israeli government, to negotiate really in good faith with the Palestinians. So there are both practical reasons in terms of the effects on Israeli and American academics. There are principled reasons which reflect a desire to maintain academic freedom worldwide, which really does have to mean free interchange. And finally, there are political reasons, for me at least, feeling that this whole boycott argument is really not an effective strategy. It's a counterproductive strategy. I'm in favor of strategies that might actually help move the Middle East to a two-state solution, which is what I've long believed in. I think to some degree, I also have to say, I think that the AAUP did a really good job of arguing the case against academic freedom, even though the ASA leadership wouldn't put our letter on their website, which they produced a very one-sided website as a way of reaching out and trying to persuade its members. But I think to some degree, the AAUP was boxed into making an argument that the ASC members really didn't care about. It's not fundamentally about academic freedom. It's not even fundamentally about boycotting Israeli universities. This effort within the ASA is part of a long-term effort to delegitimate the state of Israel. That is to remove any sense of moral authority or reason to exist for the state of Israel amongst at least opinions of American academics. And that's what it's really about, I think, fundamentally. And that's something the AAUP really wasn't prepared to address because we don't talk about, we don't officially talk about those kinds of political issues.
Eric Chaffetz, could you respond to what Carrie Nelson said, that a boycott of this kind is, first of all, counterproductive, and second of all, that this particular one is just seeking to delegitimate the state of Israel?
Well, there's no evidence of that whatsoever in any statements that the ASA has put out. Nothing about delegitimizing Israel. It has to do with protesting the oppression, the Israeli oppression of Palestinians, and the suspension of their academic rights on the West Bank and in Gaza. The AAUP standards, which are actually the gold standards for academic freedom, have nothing to do with institutions. You can read those standards. They have to do with the rights of individuals within institutions, teachers, scholars, and students, to speak out freely, particularly in relation to the scholarship that they're doing. So boycotting institutions is not directed at the academic freedom of individuals who are free to do their research, teach, and travel. The ASA has said in their statement that they welcome Israeli scholars and Palestinian scholars of all persuasions to come to ASA meetings. And I really think that to charge the ASA with trying to delegitimize the state of Israel is a very, very skewed reading of anything that the ASA has put out.
Professor Nelson, can you respond?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm glad. Hello, Eric. We've been allies on some other issues in the past, but apparently not this one. I'm very glad that Eric is an expert on academic freedom. I've, of course, co-authored a number of the AAUP's statements to that effect, and obviously I got it wrong. I'm glad to be corrected, if I can be a little bit sardonic. Look, academic freedom is also about the collective academic freedom of faculty, both of majority faculty groups and minority faculty groups. It's not just about individual academic freedom, but let's set that aside. Why do I think this whole argument within the ASA was actually about something other than an academic boycott? Yes, none of the statements that the ASC made, none of its official pronouncements said what I just said was basic impulse behind it. What I'm basing my argument on is the writings of many of the proponents of the boycott. Talk about David, Omar, Malini, people who, some of whom I've known rather well for years, and their writings, including those just published this year in the AAUP Journal of Academic Freedom, where we staged, a rather full debate on the issue of academic boycotts. Their writings made it quite clear that they feel the Israeli state has no legitimacy. They typically believe in a one-state solution. And, Americans, I think, can be persuaded that a one-state solution in the Middle East will usher in a kind of peaceable kingdom, a wondrous democratic utopia, despite the fact that, we now look at the effects of the Arab Spring and we don't see a lot of effective democracies taking shape in the Middle East. There's too much sectarian hatred. There's too little historical experience of democratic institutions. It may be in 50 years that, Egypt will have a genuine democracy. I'm kind of not holding my breath for Iran or Syria for that matter. But, looking at the one-state option, I think, is to look at large numbers of dead Arabs and dead Jews. And that's been behind the arguments that many of the advocates within the ASA and elsewhere for the eventual political solution to the crisis, the ongoing, decades-long crisis in the Middle East. So if I look at their writings, what I see is a long-term progressive effort to delegitimate the state of Israel. And this is just one stage in trying to convince people that the state of Israel has no legitimacy. And I think that hasn't been what people have been saying about this, but I think we need to say it because otherwise we don't understand why were so many ASA members uninterested in the arguments that really were focused on the problem of the boycott. The arguments that ASA leaders made in favor of the boycott were really, I think, either absurd or bogus. I mean, the president of the ASA, when challenged by the New York Times, the Times asked him, well, aren't there other states in the Middle East with much worse human rights records than Israel? And he made it's howlingly funny in one sense, but it represents political irrationality. Well, you've got to start somewhere. So I suppose that, we'll soon see an ASA resolution urging an academic boycott of China. And I think as soon as Syrian civil society gets itself together to make a request to the ASA, which of course won't happen, and it won't happen from China either, then the ASA will be ready to step up to the front based on its deep regard for human rights.
Professor Chaffetz, if you could respond. There's a lot to respond there.
Yeah.
And also just explain what this vote actually voted for.
Yeah, they voted to support the Palestinian call for an academic and cultural boycott of Israel. That's what the vote was for. As far as the writings of the 5,000 members of the American Studies Association, the very nature of academic freedom is that there are diverse responses to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some of them support a one-state solution, some of them support a two-state solution, some of them talk about both sets of solutions. This is what academic discourse does. And to try to claim that the ASA therefore represents one set of those writings by some people is, of course, to misrepresent what representation is all about. So I dismiss that. I dismiss that argument. I think Professor Nelson just carried that to extremes that are not warranted by the record in any way, shape, or form. The boycott is specifically focused on a call by Palestinian civil society, an overwhelming number of organizations, for a cultural and academic boycott of Israel because diplomacy has failed in the Middle East. The United States is not an honest broker in this process, and so it can't hope for success. And diplomacy having failed, and boycotts being a very legitimate form of civil resistance, the Palestinians called for such a boycott. The ASA responded to that call in a principled way.
But Eric Chaffetz, could you respond specifically to what Carrie Nelson said about the targeting of Israel as against many other countries with equally abusive human rights records? Is it only that their civil societies haven't asked?
And we only have 15 seconds.
Well, the first reason is, yes, there was a specific call by Palestinians to civil society. That's important. And second of all, the United States and Israel have a particularly special relationship. And Israel is a very crucial, obviously the Palestinian conflict is very crucial in the Middle East. So focusing right now on that particular relationship, I think, is very, very, very important.
We're going to have to leave it there.